I'd like to welcome everybody to the Groton Plastic Reduction Public Forum. So, my name is Bray Rafferty. Again, I'm the chair of the Groton Conservation Commission, and the Conservation Commission is the one that's sponsoring this workshop this evening. And what we want you to do is to take a look at a lot of the plastics, a variety of different displays that are here. We are here tonight to become better informed about plastics in our environment. Each table around the room has taken a different approach to educate us about plastics. From microplastics, starting over on that side, to the economics of change. And so we have an economics about changing our ways we do things with plastics back there also, as well as alternatives to if the typical plastics that we're used to using every day now that we're almost forced to use, like single-use plastic bags. We have tables out here that are going to show you alternatives that are better for the environment. In particular, before we get to our first speaker, I'd like to thank the members of the Conservation Commission for all their hard work that they've put together for tonight. Bruce Lofgren of the Planning Department, as well as the encouragement from the Groton Town Council. What we're trying to accomplish tonight is two things. One is education about plastics. And number two is, what is your feeling about making changes about the types of plastics that we utilize all the time, every day? The Groton Town Council has approached us, the Conservation Commission, to give us some insight into if we were to have an ordinance regarding ban of certain types of plastics, what might that be? Well, the state of Connecticut went ahead this past legislative session and passed a law regarding single-use plastic bags, the one that we see at the grocery store when we check out. And you've noticed that a lot of those have now disappeared. And in the few areas that still have them, that if you want to use them, there's now a dime charge for that. So what we're going to ask is that as you walk around the room and you see the whole variety of different displays that are there, and get an opportunity to chat with the folks that are there at the table, if you have any questions whatsoever, as you leave the doors over here, there is a board, a whiteboard up there, we're going to ask you to vote on. Do you think of the mayor is pointing out the board right now. We prearranged that arrangement to have her there. And there's probably 5 or 6 items that are there to say if the town of Groton should move ahead and put greater restrictions than what the state of Connecticut has now in place for all the towns. So there's a variety of towns now that have additional types of plastics that they've banned its use in their community. And the Groton Town Council would like to get some, from tonight, get some feedback from you folks about, do you think the plastic bags banned is as good? You know, that's a good start. We shouldn't mess with anything else, or is there something else in particular that you should think we should move ahead on? And so as you leave, there is an opportunity to take a sticker and place it up on the board on the variety of different items to vote yes, that also should be restricted in the future here in the town, or no. You're perfectly fine with it the way things are. So before you leave, please make sure that you vote. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Evan Ward. He's a professor at the University of Connecticut. He's the department chair now of the Marine Science Department at UConn. And we've asked him to speak to us tonight about something that, for me, it's a brand new topic called microplastics, and how they are being measured and looked at in the marine environment, and whether or not they're actually being incorporated into some of our seafood that's out there in Long Island Sound. So, without further ado, Dr. Ward.
I'm going to get up on the stage. So thank you, and I'd like to thank Bray and the Conservation Commission for inviting me here today. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some aspects of marine plastics, starting out with some macroplastics, and then moving to microplastics, and then ending with a little bit about what we're doing in our research looking at this. So yeah, if you can get the lights down a little more. There you go. Oh, that's good. That's perfect. So yeah, next slide. So just give you a feel about macroplastics, because microplastics largely come from macroplastics. Not all microplastics, but most of the microplastics come from that. So macroplastics are greater than about 1/8 of an inch. In 2010, it was estimated that 8 million metric tons of plastic waste had entered the ocean. So that's 2010 right over here. So hit it again. So we're coming up on 2020, and the estimates, high estimate, low estimate, mid estimate. So if we just take the mid estimate, by next year it's estimated that 100 million metric tons of macroplastics will be in the ocean. And I don't even know what that is. 100 million metric tons. I can't even fathom what 100 million metric tons is, but it seems like it's a lot of plastics. Next slide. So this is showing you where some of the hot spots are as far as plastic waste available to enter the oceans. So here's the scale here. So the darker colors mean there's a greater amount of plastics that can enter the oceans. The lighter colors indicate that there's lesser amounts. So you can see some of the hot spots are Indonesia and China. And before you say, well, then I guess that's their problem. Next slide. Let's take a look at where these macroplastics are being made. So the United States exports about 961,000 tons of plastics. And where does it go? It goes to the hotspots. So the companies that are selling items to these developing countries are packaging their goods in plastics and shipping them over there. And many of these countries have very little capacity for recycling or waste management, etc. So it really is becoming a global problem. So not just where the macroplastics are coming from, but who's making the macroplastics as well. Okay, next slide. So if we take a look at some of the impacts of macroplastics on marine life, many of these are sort of the poster children for macroplastics. You've probably seen a number of these pictures, but it's estimated that greater than 800 species of organisms are contaminated by plastics through entanglement, colonization, ingestion, and we've all seen impacts on megafauna, turtles, birds, fishes. They're very well documented. Here's a case where this derelict buoy was floating, and they brought it up and they noticed that there were a number of barnacles here that were not indigenous to the area were on it. So it's also, because many plastics float, it's also a way in which non-native species can be transported across the ocean. So there's a variety of different problems associated with macroplastics. Next slide. So the consensus is that macroplastics are a widespread problem, and the debris definitely affects a number of marine animals and marine birds. All right, let's turn our attention to microplastics. So these are particles that are less than about 1/8 of an inch in size. And really, this is an umbrella term for a variety of plastic types. So when you say microplastics, you can be talking about a whole bunch of different types of polymers: polyethylene, polystyrene, polypropylene, a variety of different polymer types, and many, many different shapes. And there's two categories. There's primary microplastics, which are basically microplastics that are manufactured for some type of cosmetic or personal care product or something like that. These microbeads in particular, these microplastics have been banned in Connecticut and also in the US. So they're being phased out, so we shouldn't see these types of products in our personal care, or these types of microplastics in our personal care products in the near future. So that's good news. However, a lot, if not most, of the microplastics come as secondary microplastics. So this is fragmentation of larger plastic material. So when the macroplastics are exposed to sun, they become brittle, and you're probably all familiar with, maybe you're walking on the beach and you see an old Clorox bottle or something and you step on it, you hear that crunch, right, and that poof, that's all microplastics. So all of that enters the water and contaminates nearshore and offshore environments. Next slide. So yes, fragmentation is particularly problematic, and it forms micro and nano. Nanoplastics are also a problem. Nanoplastics are even smaller than microplastics. Not even going to start talking about those today, but that's another issue. And yeah, spherical angular particles, films you often see, and fibers from clothes and ropes that abrade, get into our waterways and then into the oceans. Next slide. Oh, and this was a popular piece that came out in The Guardian, I think earlier this year. And basically, you can read the headline there, and the bottom line is that where anywhere anyone has looked for microplastics, they have found them. So microplastics have been found in the deep sea, they've been found in the Arctic, they've been found in the Antarctic. Anywhere we look, we can find microplastics. So they have literally contaminated all oceans and seas around the world. Okay, next slide. So what about the concentrations of microplastics? Well, this is a tougher question to address than you might think. And the reason is because it varies considerably based upon location, normally population size, but also random ocean processes. Currents can carry microplastics to one spot and accumulate them and prevent them from going to another spot. Additionally, there's a little standardization of methods right now for collecting and identifying microplastics. So some people use nets here. Other people bulk will collect the water with pumps and analyze that. Some people use plankton pumps. So there's a variety of different ways, and you can imagine that it depends also on the size of the mesh, so mesh size can vary. So there are a lot of different methodological issues we have to work out before we really can get a handle on the concentration of microplastics. Also, collecting them is difficult and time-consuming, and when you collect, the collection is episodic. You're usually not out there every single day collecting microplastics. So with all those caveats in mind, next slide, we can take a look at some verified concentrations. And this is a piece we put together for a paper of ours last year. This is in abundance of plastic particles in meters cubed, which is, so if you think about a cubic meter, then the volume of water in that, but I've translated it to gallons. So basically, where we've been looking 1 to 26 particles per gallon of seawater. And that doesn't sound like too much, 1 particle per gallon. But Long Island Sound has 18 trillion gallons. So even if we say, all right, sort of 10 particles, because the mathematics is easier to do in my head right now, that's 180 trillion particles just in Long Island Sound. And there was a study done a couple years back where they estimated that that number of particles, again, depending on that range, adds up to anywhere between 7,000 and about 270,000 tons of microplastics in the water. Okay, next slide. So the consensus here is that microplastics fragment from macroplastic debris. Microplastics are universally found. Suspended concentrations right now are sort of on the low side, but they're increasing. They're going to increase because all of that macroplastics that is in the oceans now, it's going to be very difficult to get it out. It's going to eventually fragment and become microplastics. And this is likely an underestimate because most of the studies looking at microplastics looked at microplastics greater than 1/1500th of an inch. And that might sound really, really small, but that's about 10 micrometers or so. And there are microplastics that are smaller than that, which are harder to identify. So certainly a lot more work to be done. Okay, next slide. All right, what about microplastic ingestion and effects? Well, numerous studies, including ours, have documented cases of ingestion by suspension feeders, deposit feeders, number of fishes, and even deep sea animals. Next slide. If you take a look at the number of microplastic particles per individual, it's sort of low to moderate. So if you look through the literature in bivalves, such as oysters and clams and mussels, there's about 0 to 9 particles per individual, again, depending on what location you're collecting those animals from. Various deposit-feeding worms have about 1 to 3 particles per gram. And fishes, depending on the species of fish, 0 to 10 particles per individual. Next slide. And in some lab studies, negative effects of microplastics have been found. And these include negative effects on feeding, digestive processes, energy reserves, and cell biochemistry. And of course, it depends on the concentration of microplastics that you use. So that's something that needs to be sorted out as well. But definitely some lab studies have shown some negative effects. Okay, next slide. So the consensus, and I put a question mark because I'm not so sure. If I was in a scientific meeting with a lot of other scientists who study microplastics, I'm sure I'd get some arguments from this. But anyhow, marine animals are exposed to and ingest microplastics. That's really a given. The concentration in the gut is relatively low right now, but again, this is going to increase in the future. And many questions still remain regarding the effects of the microplastics on the organisms. Next slide. All right, well, what about shellfish contamination? I get a lot of questions about that. So we study bivalve shellfish. My students joke that I never study anything I can't eat, which might be true. Why study bivalves? Well, they're ecologically important. They can filter 1 to 2 gallons per hour. So an adult oyster can filter 1 to 2 gallons of water per hour and strip particles from that water. So they have a great potential to accumulate microplastics and therefore maybe some negative effects. Yep, next slide. Also, bivalves are consumed by animals of a higher trophic level, including humans. And so there is a concern about the transfer of pollutants, microplastic pollutants, to other organisms, including humans. Yep. So what we're looking at is which types of microplastics do bivalves actually take up? Which ones do they actually ingest and potentially retain in their system? So I'm going to show you just a little bit about our current research. And I have some other video over on that table, which you can look at afterward. And we have an oyster that's opened up, and we can put some plastic particles on so you can see what's going on with an oyster that's open. But when we do studies with bivalves, one of the things we like to do is use this technique called video endoscopy that I developed many, many moons ago. And so this allows us to put this endoscope optical insertion tube down into an intact living animal. We don't have to take it apart. We don't have to take the shell off or anything like that. So this is very similar to the medical instruments that physicians use to look into tight places of the human body. It's very similar. And here's a close-up. This is a clam with the optical insertion tube here inside the animal. We turn the light on. Looks like a little jack-o'-lantern now. This is cold light. So the light source is off to the side, and it's fiber optic cables deliver the light down, so it is cold light, so there's no heat associated with this light. So with that, we can get sort of a bird's eye view, if you will, of what's going on in the animal. So if you can scroll over here and then hit the, should be able to see, there you go, and hit the play. Yeah, I think if you just click on it, it should start. Yep. Okay, so here we are adding some plastic particles to a mussel. You can see them being drawn in to the animal. Now we're looking through the endoscope, nice magnified version, and you can see the particles whipping by. And now what we're going to do is go in between the shells and zoom in on the gills, which are the filtering apparatus of the animal. And here we are landing on the gills. It looks like a little filter, doesn't it? And we're going to add some yellow polystyrene beads. Here they come. These are about 20 micrometers in size. And there they're getting captured by the gill. And the cilia on the gill, which you can't see, the cilia is too small, are moving and directing those particles towards a food groove. Here are fibers, same thing. Here they are collecting on this groove here, and they're being taken towards the mouth. This is an oyster now. Oyster has a different type of gill. Same thing, particles being captured. There were some fibers. We also added some of those yellow beads, and they're taken towards the mouth. Now, right before the mouth, with bivalves, right before the mouth, they have another set of organs that are called the labial palps. And those set of organs can sort particles. And they're actually very good at sorting particles. It's actually quite amazing. Next slide. So from this, we know that bivalves capture and ingest plastics of various size and shape, but they also reject a lot of the plastic particles that they capture, and that's important. So here's some data from a study we did last summer and just got published this year. So this is the particle size, and these were spheres, so these are spherical particles. And this is the percent of those particles that are rejected. The red is the oyster, and the blue is a mussel. And you can see that as we increase the size of the particles, more and more and more of those particles are spit out before they're ingested. And they're spit out in what's called pseudofeces. I didn't make that up. That's actually the term, what it's called, because it actually never goes into the animal. So it's rejected before it's ingested. Next slide. Of the particles that are ingested, a large portion of them are rapidly eliminated in the feces. So here's we've loaded up some oysters and mussels with some particles, plastic particles, and we're looking at time now, and we're looking at egestion. So at 6 hours, they ingested this number of spheres, and then at 24 hours here, and at 48, and by 72, there's hardly any spheres left in them. So this is really sort of good news for bivalves. Because bivalves are selective, they are not indiscriminatory particle feeders. They select the particles that they ingest. They spit out and then egest, they defecate a vast majority of the particles they come in contact with. Next slide. So the perspective is if these are the plastic particles in the environment and they're being taken up by mussels, go ahead. I showed you that a lot of those particles are rejected in pseudofeces over a couple minutes. So it only takes a few minutes for them to start spitting out these plastic particles. Go ahead. Particles that they end up ingesting, though, are egested in feces pretty quickly, in 3 hours or less. A lot of those particles come out. So, one more. So the bottom line is when you look at the number of plastic particles in the bivalve, there's actually not that many, which is good news for bivalves and for people who like to eat bivalves. Next slide. Okay, so I just want to end with some items that I think are challenges for the future, and some of the demonstrations here, the displays, touch on these. So certainly there are engineering solutions to the problem of macro and microplastics. So plant-based polymers, for example, chemical advances which would increase our capacity for recycling, and various types of green chemistry. So that's one challenge for future engineers. There are also policy and regulatory solutions, so bans and deposits. Bray, you've talked about that just a little bit. And also making the manufacturers more accountable for the products that they produce. If you go to Europe, Germany, for example, they have new regulations regarding plastics. So the manufacturer of those plastics, so the Coke bottles and water bottles and things like that, they're responsible for the end of the life of that plastic. So they have to run the recycling centers and they are responsible for taking care of that material that they produce. And then certainly social and behavioral solutions as well. Education, reduce, recycle, and reuse. I think the education is very important, and over the last, I've been working with microplastics and bivalves for over 10 years now, and I definitely see a tipping point coming. You see it in Connecticut now and some other states where we're not using the plastic bags anymore. I think plastic bottles is another one. We really need to rethink all of the plastic bottles. If you drive along any road in Connecticut and you look on the side, you'll see plastic bottles, and they're going to end up in the ocean, and most of them are going to break down and become microplastics. Okay. And that's it. So I'm just going to end there just to acknowledge some people. Sandy Shubwayne is a colleague of mine, and my research assistant. Kayla, my grad student, is, oh, there you are. Okay, is there. So she's going to be over by the microscope in a little bit. And some of the funding agencies, the USDA and NOAA Marine Debris Program. So I'll end there and take any questions. Thank you. Right. So there's probably an hour's worth of discussion in that question. So the capacity in the United States for recycling is very low. And that was brought to light when China stopped taking our recyclables. So my understanding from people that work in recycling is that there are warehouses now filling up with, bins of recyclable plastics that hopefully one day will go into the stream, right, in the recycling stream. So that's number one. We're greatly under capacity. We need to build more recycling plants. We need more education. Right. I work with plastics. I still don't know exactly what I'm supposed to throw into the recycling bin, right? I know, yeah, bags are separate. You put those separate. But the different types of plastics that are around, yeah, so definitely better education with that. And the other thing is try not to engage in what's called wish cycling, where you don't know what to do with something, so you say, well, I'll just throw it in the recycling bin, right? So yeah, try to figure out what's supposed to go in the recycling bin, and then only put that in the recycling bin. Yeah. Yes. Oh, so he was asking whether I knew how many microplastics are in fish. So salmon, cod. So I don't have those numbers on top of my head, but if you just Google that, there are plenty of papers that have looked at that. Now the difference though is that with fish, most fish, although there are some, like sardines, I guess we eat whole. Most fish, we only eat the flesh, right? You're cutting the, and so the translocation of particles from their gut to the mussels is very low. So although you can find plastics in the gut, often you don't find them in the tissues. Now, after saying that, however, fish tend to eat larger pieces of plastic, and those larger pieces of plastic, when they're exposed to gut enzymes, can leach chemical compounds as well. And so the chemical compounds that leach can get into the tissue. Yeah. Yep. And then we'll work our way back.
You've talked about where the plastics go inside the bivalve. Where do they go when they get inside us?
There's very little data on that, actually. There was one study, do you remember when that was, with they actually analyzed people's feces, right? Yeah, right. And so, yeah, I mean, everyone they analyzed, they had microplastics.
But what tissues are they?
But they didn't know, because no one's, I'm not even sure if NIH is sort of, that's on their radar. That would be NIH, right? National Institutes of Health would need to have that type of a study and take a look at human tissues. Yeah. Yep. And then we'll go back. Yeah. Just work our way back.
Thanks. Are there other components of plastics that you're not mentioning? You're only talking about particles, but aren't there gaseous and liquid and other chemicals, things that are going in the environment from plastics?
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Is that a bigger proportion, or is it mostly particles?
Well, all the plastics leach plasticizers. So at some point in time, though, as they fragment and get smaller, there's increased surface area, and eventually there's probably very little material to leach out anymore. but it's still entering the environment. I don't know much about that. My guess is that there's bacterial degradation of some of that because it's carbon-based. But right, that's another issue, is not just the plastic itself, but what's leaching from the plastic when it gets into these organisms. Yeah. Yep, and then, yeah. Go ahead, yes, yeah.
How successful has the German model been, where the manufacturers of plastics have been responsible for the final use, final disposition of them?
Right, I think that's relatively a relatively recent regulation that Germany put into place. So I don't know for sure. I attend a lot of macro and microplastic meetings, and there have been people from Europe that have been talking about these regulations that are going in place. So my guess is you'd have to give it like 5 years or so to see. But at least it's a start to tell the manufacturers that you're responsible for the end of life of your product. Yeah. Because that's what's happening in Malaysia, right? And to a lesser extent China, is that Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola are sending all of this plastic over there. And you saw some of the pictures in the beginning, right, with that little girl's head. I mean, I've seen pictures where these canals are literally 3 feet of plastic bottles and plastic crap in Malaysia. Yeah. So, yes, the woman in green shirt. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
The other person asked the question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If it's a carbon-based, is there some technology that could be developed to digest it? Have giant digesters,
Yeah.
and you could capture a lot of these
Right.
piles
And
of
so
plastic?
some of the recyclable plastic material, like the recyclable spoons and forks, those are only recyclable under industrial, compostable forks and knives are only compostable under industrial composts. So if you take that and throw it in your backyard compost, it'll sit there. Nothing will happen to it. So it's compostable under certain situations, under certain temperature and pressure. Then it'll compost with certain bacteria. So there are ways to do that. But the capacity to do that in the U.S. is just so low. It's like the recycling capacity is so low because for years and years and years, we've just been sending our stuff over to China and letting them take care of it. We can't do that anymore. But yes, engineering solutions, definitely. Definitely. And actually, I'm on a proposal right now with some engineers up at the main campus, UConn, where the subject is end of life of macroplastics. So to come up with engineering solutions and biological solutions to not just break down new types of plastics, but old plastics. Because there are bacteria currently in the environment that break down plastics. So if you take a look at plastics and you look at it under a scanning electron microscope, you can see the bacteria and you can see these little pits that they've formed. And they will break down the plastics, the polymers. So the idea is to try to use those, right? Find out which type of bacteria they are, and we were talking about biofermenters, and maybe try to break down plastics that way. Yeah. So definitely engineering, yeah.
I just want to point out that in the back of the room we do have SCARA here, and they're the experts on the triangles and where you can and can't, what you can and can't recycle. And also we have a human impact, microplastics impact on human health over there. So when we get back to our forum, we've tried to address some of these things for everybody to talk to the experts on as well.
Great, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, and then I'll come over here. Yeah.
Yeah, that initial graph that you showed us with the projected increase
Right.
in, I think that was micro, I forget.
Yeah, it's macro. It's, macroplastic.
But have you tried to figure out if we can get away with just recycling and all these digestion and all these things short of stopping production of, and what is the proportion that can be removed from the environment through all the engineering and recycling as opposed to outright stopping production, and what is that ratio?
Right, right. So again, I don't have those numbers on the top of my head, but from meetings I've gone to, I can tell you the following. One is that even though there are companies out there trying to do this, the Ocean Cleanup is one of them, where they've constructed this giant buoy that they've taken out to the Pacific, and then it fell apart, and they had to bring it back and try it again. That's very controversial for a couple reasons. Number one is, I don't know if it'll work or not. I'm skeptical it's going to take a lot of plastics out just because how big the Pacific Ocean is. And even if you have a 2-kilometer boom, I mean, you know, you get up in a airplane 30,000 feet, you can't see it, right? You can see the Pacific Ocean, but you know, you can't even see it. The other thing is that do we want to advertise something like, hey, we're taking all the trash out of the Pacific Ocean. We don't have to worry about recycling anymore. Just throw it in and we'll take it out, right? And so that's the other controversy is people are saying, well, it's not going to work, but people are going to get the false idea that it does work and not care, right? So that might be a problem associated with trying to get it off. Stopping the flow, right? So I heard an analogy which I think is really good a couple months ago. So if you went into your kitchen and the water was running into your sink and the sink was overflowing with water and all over your floor, what would you do first? Would you grab a bucket and mop? Or would you turn the faucet off? You turn the faucet off, that's right, first. So I agree, we got to turn the faucet off, right? That's somehow turn the faucet off. But on the other hand, plastics have made our life a lot better, right? Lighter cars, more fuel-efficient cars, medical, you know, so we're not going to get rid of all plastics, or should we? But there are a lot of plastics we use that we don't really need that are just for convenience. Most of us are old enough to remember, you know, when I was a kid, I don't even really remember having plastic anything, right? I mean, we had paper, we had glass, but it was easier, it's cheaper to transport in plastic because it's lighter, but we sort of got lulled into this idea that, oh, plastics are great and we just use all this plastics. We could all live with, you know, at least 50% less plastic in our life, I'm pretty sure. So I agree, I think turning off the faucet is something we need to do. Yeah, right away. A little more questions? Okay. Okay.
I'd like to thank Dr. Ward one more time. Thank him very much. And he's going to be over at the table with his grad student, and they're going to be showing a demonstration on the oysters actually trying to feed on microplastic particles. So I'm going to release you after one more item, and that is, yes?
I have one question I think is important for the doctor. Yes. Have you been able to identify the plastic that you're finding, the microplastics, in the ocean? Would you agree with the Ocean Conservancy that it is coming from bottles, or are you seeing it from plastic bags or high-density polyethylene bags? Can you identify the source of the material?
I'm going to give you to the person that really knows this stuff, and that's my graduate student.
Okay, thank you.
This is what I spend my life doing. So far, it's a little bit of a painstaking process, which is why when Evan was talking about how methods aren't finalized for everybody, not everybody knows, you know, how to actually capture these microplastics from our samples, right? That's part of the process. But what we have found, and what's been found a lot in the literature, are actually fibers. So a lot of plastic fibers from maybe clothing, right? Is a huge source. So that's why all these things like the Cora ball, if you guys haven't heard of it, you like put it in your washer machine and it helps capture any of the fibers that are, oh, there you go, right there. So, so that's an awesome example of ways that they're trying to prevent that. But it's a lot of fibers. You find all different kinds of things. I don't think there's one particular source that you could pin it on. You can't just say water bottles or forks, plastic forks and knives. I think it's, you know, a wider issue than that.
Hi, CIEL has put out a shoreline data. If you're thinking about shoreline plastics and litter going into the sound in the ocean, CIEL, it's It's that report there. They put out the 20 top sources of shoreline pollution, and they include things like bottle caps and bottles and cigarette butts and things that you might not think of as being plastic. I've got a copy of that sheet over at that table.